Grace and peace to you from the one who is, and who was, and who is to come. Let's say you're about to start a long trip. Everything and everyone is in the car. You know what your final destination is, but you're not 100% sure how you're going to get there. And to make matters just a little more complicated, you're pretty sure there are going to be some detours and some side trips along the way. As you get on the road, would you rather have someone point in the direction of your destination and say, just keep going that way, good luck? Or would you rather have GPS? People would have GPS. Now, with someone pointing you in the right direction, you're on your own when you come to a detour, when you try to avoid construction, or if you miss that exit. But with the GPS, you enter your destination, and every time something takes you off your route that gets you to the destination, it pipes up and says, recalculating. Your destination stays the same, but based on where you've ended up and what direction you're going, it changes the route so you still get to your destination. And unlike someone pointing you in the right direction and sending you on your way, that GPS is with you for the whole trip. It never stops recalculating, even if you choose not to listen to it. That GPS is bound and determined to get you to your destination, and it will never throw its hands up and say, you're on your own, if you refuse to listen. When Moses spoke the words we heard from Deuteronomy today, he spoke them to the people as they stood just across the Jordan River from the Promised Land. On their way to the spot where we find them in Scripture today, the Israelites had learned a lot about recalculating. A journey that could have taken just a few weeks had stretched into 40 years in the wilderness. The problem was that the people kept leaving the route God had mapped out for them, the route of living in loving trust. But God hadn't just stood on the shore of the Red Sea, pointed toward the Promised Land, and said, keep going that way, good luck. God was with them every step of the way, and never stopped recalculating their route to keep them moving toward their destination. Not simply the land that God had promised to Abraham and his descendants, but the place where the people would live in loving relationship with God and with neighbor. On the journey to this place, as Moses was at the top of Mount Sinai receiving the 10 Commandments from God, the people left the route of faithfulness to the God of Abraham. They made a golden calf to worship as their God. But rather than let the people go further down this route that led away from their true destination, God recalculated. Though Moses had smashed the tablets with the commandments in anger, God gave the people a new set. And those tablets were inscribed with directions to help them stay on the route of living a life where they loved God and loved neighbor. When they left Mount Sinai, the people left the route of gratitude to God for delivering them from slavery in Egypt. The people began grumbling in the desert, and a let's go back to Egypt movement sprung up among the people. But instead of leaving the people to their own devices in the desert, God recalculated. God gave the hungry people manna and quails to feed them along the way. And deep in that wilderness, the people left the route of trusting God to provide. They asked Moses and God, did you just bring us out of Egypt so we would die of thirst here in the desert? But God didn't throw divine hands up in the air and say, you're on your own. God recalculated and made water gush from a rock in the desert. Now, after all these detours and all these times when they got lost, the people are standing across the river from the Promised Land. They can see the place that had been their destination for 40 years. Moses knows he's not going to make the last leg of the journey. So he preaches what might be the longest sermon on record, that whole book of Deuteronomy. The words we heard today are the conclusion to this farewell sermon. Moses tells the people, see, I've set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants might live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him, and holding fast to him. Knowing how much recalculating it took to get the people to where they are when Moses begs them to choose life is important for understanding this invitation he gives the people. Moses is not standing there telling the people, follow this direction about choosing life, and you'll be fine. Moses has retold the story of their entire journey, the one where God has been with them every step of the way. God has been recalculating at each and every turn to put the people back on the route, not just to the promised land as a place on the map, but as the place where the people will live in loving relationship with God and with neighbor. Choosing life is not Moses pointing the people in the right direction and sending them on their way. That call to choose life grows from a relationship where God has already chosen life for God's people. And like a GPS, has been constantly guiding the people to that life he's chosen them for. God is with them every step of the way, recalculating every time the people take a wrong turn. Moses reminds the people that they can see God recalculating through that whole story of the journey out of slavery in Egypt and to life as God's people in the promised land. Reading this story as Christians, we can also see God recalculating the route to life through the cross. Jesus came to lead us along the route that led to life with God, and we rerouted him to the cross. The cross wasn't just a detour off of whatever route people were on. It was something created to violently run people off the road to life. And this is exactly what happened to Jesus on the cross. But God acted with the power to recalculate and put Jesus back on the route to life in the resurrection. The cross and the empty tomb show us just how much power God has to recalculate and put us back on the route that leads to life lived in loving relationship with God and with neighbor. As God recalculates to keep us on the path to loving him and loving neighbor, our calling as disciples is to find the places where God is recalculating and telling us we need to adjust our route. Learning how to spot those places where God is recalculating and telling us to adjust our route takes a lifetime. This is because our whole lives are filled with chances to make choices that either keep us on the route to life or veer us onto a different path. These choices can be as big as how we make our livelihood, or as small as when we choose to listen to another person. These choices might come along once in a lifetime or cross our path each and every day. They might be choices that leave a lasting impact or things that go unnoticed. Like the Israelites on their way to the promised land, God doesn't just leave us to our own devices as we come across all these places where we may or may not stay on the route that leads to him. As devoted disciples of Jesus Christ, we can look to the cross for guidance first. Jesus bears the cross for us. So one clue as we try to find where God is recalculating is to look for the burdens we can bear to bless our neighbors and help them more fully, live more fully. And we aren't alone in trying to learn to listen for where God is recalculating. God gathers us into community. As a community, we begin our worship together by acknowledging that we've lost our way and asking for God to get us back on the right route. We gather around God's table to be renewed in the promise of God's great recalculation, the resurrection. In Sunday school, in confirmation, youth events, adult education, Bible study, we learn about that route God has planned and about the ways God has recalculated that route for his people again and again. This blesses us with a better sense of whether we're on that route, and if we're not, it helps us learn to hear God recalculating our route to make sure it still leads to him. When we gather as groups for parents, groups for seniors, musical groups, even the committees and council that give shape to our ministry together, we're discerning if we're on the route God calls us to follow. And together, we're listening for where God is recalculating to get us back on that route that leads to him. As disciples, as people who have committed to following the route that leads to a life of loving God and loving neighbor, we know that God will get us to that final destination. In the same way we might set our GPS that helps us find our way on the road, God has already set our destination for life with Him. And like that GPS that keeps recalculating every time we get on the wrong road, God is with us at every turn along the route, recalculating so we can get back on the route that leads to loving God, the route that leads to loving neighbor, the route that leads to new life now and resurrection life to come. Thanks be to God.
Amen.